Let's break down a pretty powerful argument that questions traditional Islam. It all starts with one question.
So, what has God done to you? The speaker says this question shows that people are getting things wrong.
He thinks people ask this when they mix up man-made traditions with God's actual divine religion.
And here's his main point. There are really two different religions being talked about here, right?
So he throws down a challenge. Can you back up what you believe using just the Quran?
He points to some really harsh punishments, saying they come from tradition, not the Quran itself.
So, the big question is, are these rules really from God's book or from somewhere else?
And it's not just about laws, it's also about core beliefs about the end times,
Take the afterlife. The Quran says 2 lives. Tradition says 3. That's a huge difference, he highlights.
He says these extra ideas just create fear and make people turn away from the religion altogether.
Okay, so where does he get this whole Quran-only approach? What's his justification for it?
Well, it all comes down to this one verse. He sees it as a direct command from God.
And he backs this up with other verses, basically saying, don't add rules God didn't reveal.
His whole point is that God's religion isn't supposed to be complicated or a heavy burden. And that brings us right back to the start. It's the man-made stuff, he says, that makes people question God.
So, it all boils down to this. Is the Quran the only source of divine law or not?
All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping into a really powerful critique from within Islamic thought, and it's all based on the arguments of a speaker named Hamid Nasradan. His whole point is that there's this huge fundamental confusion between what's divine scripture and what's just human tradition, and he thinks that confusion has led a lot of people astray. And really, his entire argument kicks off with this one single question, and it's a provocative one. He's really clear about this. This isn't some attack from the outside. He says it's a cry of anguish coming from inside the faith. It's a question that he believes is born out of some really deep, painful confusion. So what's really behind a question like that? Well, according to the speaker, it's not an attack on God at all, not even close. He sees it as a symptom of a much deeper problem. The issue, he says, is that believers are mixing up man-made rules and, frankly, some pretty harsh traditions with actual divine religion. And so, when they end up suffering because of those rules, who do they blame? They turn their frustration back on God. So how do you even begin to fix a problem like that? Well, the speaker says there's a crucial first step we have to take, and that's making a really clear, fundamental distinction between two things: religion and tradition. And he actually has a specific name for these man-made additions. He calls them Khurofats. Now, you're going to want to remember that term because it's key to his whole argument. It basically means superstitions or myths or traditions, things that have been added onto the faith over centuries. And in his view, they've completely blurred the line between what's true divine religion and what's not. Okay, and this right here really frames the central conflict perfectly. On one side, you've got Deen. That's what he calls true religion, and for him, that comes only from the Quran, period. Then, on the other side, you have Khurofat, and this is where it gets really interesting, because for him, this category includes sources that are, they're foundational to mainstream Islamic thought. We're talking about the Hadith, the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, plus centuries of scholarly opinions and cultural practices. He puts all of that under the label of human additions. So, once he's made that distinction crystal clear, he starts to systematically deconstruct several common beliefs that are held in a lot of traditional Islamic circles. And he challenges every single one of them on one simple but really powerful basis. He claims they just aren't in the Quran. And he starts with a big one. He goes right after one of the most severe rulings you'll find in many traditional schools of thought, the death penalty for apostasy, for someone leaving the faith. And then he just lays down this direct challenge. His logic is simple. If a rule is truly part of the religion, if it's deen, then it has to be written down explicitly in the foundational text. No exceptions. So here's the bottom line. The speaker is saying that these rules, things like killing an apostate, executing someone for not praying, stoning an adulterer, or even making belief in the Mahdi a sort of prophesied redeemer figure, a condition of your faith, none of that, he says, is part of the deen, the true religion. And why? Simple. Because he claims you just can't find them in the Quran. And then he throws down the gauntlet, challenging anyone to show him a single verse that proves him wrong. Okay, so this probably has you wondering, On what authority is he making such a huge, sweeping critique? I mean, who is he to say all this? Well, his answer is that his authority comes from the Quran itself, from a principle he believes the book sets for itself. He grounds his entire argument right here, in the scripture, pointing to verses just like this one. The way he interprets it, the Quran is declaring itself to be the ultimate and the only legitimate source for religious law. So from his point of view, if you make a judgment based on any source outside the Quran, it's just not valid. And this verse right here, it really drives his point home. He argues that the Quran isn't just a guide. It's presented as the main tool for debate. It's the standard. It's the yardstick against which all religious claims have to be measured. For him, the struggle for truth is a fight you wage with the Quran. Now, applying this super strict Quran-only method doesn't just shake up legal rulings. It actually leads to some major reinterpretations of core beliefs, like what happens to a person right after they die. So the speaker completely rejects the mainstream idea of barzakh. Now, that's typically understood as this sort of intermediate life in the grave where you're questioned before Judgment Day. If you look at this table, you can see the difference. The traditional view has 3 stages: your life here, then this barzakh life in the grave, and then the afterlife. But the speaker's view, which he says is purely from the Quran, only has 2. For him, that time between death and resurrection, it's not a second life at all. It's just nothing, a state of non-existence, kind of like being asleep. And in his mind, this is definitive. He argues that all those popular beliefs about angels questioning you in the grave, or punishments from snakes and scorpions, he says these are perfect examples of Khurofat. They're compelling stories, sure, but they are traditions that he claims have 0 basis in the Quran. And all of this brings us right back to where we started. Back to that initial painful question, and what the speaker proposes as the only way out of this crisis of faith. His solution is pretty straightforward. He argues that if Muslims would just strip away all the layers of human tradition, the stuff that's not in the Quran, they would find a religion that's free from all the harsh rules that are causing so much suffering. And if they did that, that question, what has God done to you? Well, it would never even come up, because they'd realize the rules they hate aren't from God at all. They're from other people. So when you boil it all down, the speaker's entire argument really comes down to this one fundamental question. Where does religious authority actually come from? When the scripture is silent on something, where do you turn? Do you look to centuries of tradition and scholarly wisdom, or does all authority begin and end with the text alone? You know, it's a huge question, and it's at the heart of so many faiths, not just this one. And it's a question that ultimately every believer has to answer for themselves. This is the brief on the Quran-only standard in Islamic debate. So we're diving into a really passionate theological debate here. It's one that challenges a lot of established religious practices by demanding that Islam, or deen, be defined strictly and solely by what's actually in the Quran. First, the primary argument is that true Islamic faith has to adhere exclusively to the commandments found right there in the text. The speaker is really critical of blending religion with, cultural practices or superstitions. So any rule, whether it permits or forbids something, is considered invalid if it doesn't have a direct Quranic basis. Second, this then targets specific rulings that are pretty commonly accepted, but, it's argued, are completely absent from the Quran. For instance, things like capital punishment for apostates or for those who don't pray, and even the stoning of adulterers. Beliefs like the coming of the Mahdi and the descent of Jesus are also listed as ideas that are not conditions of faith. And finally, the discussion really challenges traditional views of the afterlife. It rejects widely taught concepts like grave punishment and the barzakh life, which is that intermediate stage between death and resurrection. The claim is that the Quran explicitly describes only 2 lives for us, life in this world and life in the hereafter. Ultimately, this whole analysis zeroes in on whether religious authority should be limited strictly to the Quran, or if traditions and external interpretations define the practice of Islam.
Welcome back. Today we're looking at a theological critique arguing that true Islam must strictly follow the Quran, and it challenges several beliefs that don't have direct Quranic evidence.
Yes, and this is really strong material. I have to say, the intellectual rigor it's very commendable. But before we get into the details, I think the foundation is solid, but we can really work on maximizing its persuasive force.
I agree. I mean, the case it makes for purifying the faith, by highlighting what's missing from the opposition's arguments.
Oh, it's powerful.
It's very forceful. things like punishment for apostasy or for not praying.
For sure, but I do wonder if that focus on negation, on what's not there, creates a bit of an imbalance in the structure.
How so?
Well, here's my first big thought. While the material provides a devastating critique of additions to the faith, strengthening the core argument requires shifting the emphasis from negation to the proactive, positive articulation of a comprehensive, Quran-only framework.
Okay, I see that. So the listener is currently relying heavily on demanding opponents bring a single verse.
Which is a strong tactic.
It is, but it means the entire piece is weighted toward challenging what exists, not building what should exist in its place. It leaves a kind of void, doesn't it? It feels reactive.
Exactly. Reactive. That's the perfect word. And that's the core weakness here. That defensive reliance on negation, it spends so much time. I think the note said something like 100 hours of lessons.
Yeah, 100 hours.
Proving what isn't in the book, like the concepts of grave punishment or the intermediate life. And while that's necessary, that much negation it can cause real intellectual fatigue for the reader.
Yes.
I feel like I've read 1,000 pages on what's wrong, and I'm still sitting here waiting for the positive alternative.
And that's the crucial fix. The suggestion for improvement has to be this: dedicate substantially more space to actually constructing the affirmative vision. What does the Quran require?
So the methodology becomes a complete self-sustaining system.
A self-sustaining system of faith, not just a list of theological rejections. I mean, if you're going to tear down the opposition's house, you have to immediately give your reader a new one to live in. Okay, let's make that concrete. An actionable example. Instead of spending, say, another 10 pages demonstrating the lack of support for grave punishment.
Which we know you've done thoroughly.
Right. You could streamline that. And the space you get back should be used to proactively introduce a detailed explanation of the two lives the Quran does acknowledge.
Worldly life and the afterlife.
Exactly. Defined wholly and completely by the text.
And to build on that, the material itself points out that those who rely solely on the Quran will not be condemned. That's such a powerful statement.
It is.
So use that analogy. Use it to build out a full mission statement, detailed precisely how your proposed path, ensures the completion of Islam. Don't just focus on the opposition's incompleteness.
It's a structural shift. It changes the entire frame, from defense to construction.
And that makes the argument so much more persuasive. It moves from "you are wrong" to something more like "here is the comprehensive, self-evident truth."
I think that's a much more welcoming position. A powerful reframing.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about delivery, because the passion behind this it's undeniable.
Oh yeah, it comes through on every page.
But that same passion, I think, is presenting a significant rhetorical challenge, especially if the goal is to reach the broadest possible audience.
I noticed that too. The conviction is strong, maybe a little too strong. The tone can feel alienating at times.
I think that's it. So our second point would be this. To maximize the material's potential impact and ensure dialogue with the intended audience, a subtle modulation of the tone is needed to shift the rhetorical emphasis from accusation toward intellectual clarification.
Right. The weakness there is definitely the confrontational rhetoric. I saw repeated use of phrases that come across as, "What has God done to you?"
Exactly.
And it's questioning the fundamental commitment of people who follow traditional schools of thought. That phrasing suggests their motivation is the cause of societal skepticism, like it's theological negligence or something malicious.
And that's precisely where the piece risks losing people. People who might otherwise be totally open to a methodological discussion.
Yeah, you give them an emotional target to defend.
You do. And it completely diverts their attention away from the intellectual merits of your argument.
So the suggestion isn't to dilute the challenge. Not at all.
No. You have to preserve the passion. The suggestion is to reframe it. Focus the critical points on the misapplication of method, not on the perceived moral failure of the people who follow it.
The goal should be to invite them into a shared space of analysis.
A shared space of Quranic analysis, yeah, not to condemn their entire historical school of thought.
So you want the reader to feel challenged by the logic, not personally attacked.
That's absolutely right. For example, when you discuss the gravity of legislating rulings without a divine source, which is a huge focus of your work, concentrate the critique on the legal methodology.
You can still cite the definitive warnings in the Quran that those who don't judge by what God revealed are transgressors or wrongdoers.
Exactly. You hit hard on the methodology, but you decouple that error from the highly charged rhetorical question about their motivation.
That maintains the intellectual force without the personal attack.
Precisely. And instead of saying something like the opponent deserves to be cursed or blamed for relying on their own views, you frame it as an unavoidable intellectual consequence. Something like, when one speaks without the evidence of God's book, they inevitably open themselves to questioning.
Allowing their personal view to be the target of critique, rather than the revelation itself.
There you go. That framing is brilliant.
It takes the target off the person's character and puts it squarely on their source material.
Exactly. It keeps the focus on the book, not the person, which is the whole point of the piece, isn't it?
It is. It makes the message far easier to receive, much more constructive.
Ah, okay. I think I see where you're going with this.
It's an issue of intellectual depth, really.
Right. The material makes these really powerful demands for direct proof, for practices like the killing of apostates, for stoning.
Very powerful demands.
But the weakness, I think, is that by only focusing on the lack of a single clear verse, it kind of bypasses the established interpretive mechanism.
Yes, the mechanism.
Which is usually the collected traditions or scholarly consensus that the traditional schools use to justify these things. And if you ignore that, your critique becomes vulnerable, right? The opponent will just turn around and say, you're ignoring the historical process of jurisprudence. These rulings weren't just pulled out of thin air.
Which is a fair counter-argument if you don't address it.
It's the counter-argument we need to anticipate and neutralize. So here's the topic sentence. Acknowledging the interpretive history behind highly contested rulings allows the material to offer a more sophisticated and persuasive rejection, demonstrating not just an absence of evidence, but a comprehensive understanding of the system being challenged.
So the suggestion is to briefly, and I guess strategically, acknowledge their reliance on secondary sources.
Exactly. You say, we know scholars brought these forward. You show you understand how they justify rulings that aren't in the Quran. And then you pivot.
Hard.
And immediately assert that this secondary material must be rejected when it fundamentally contradicts the self-sufficiency of the book.
Yes. It's a strategic nod. You demonstrate awareness of their framework just long enough to assert the supremacy of yours. It adds so much weight because it shows you're not just reading the Quran in a vacuum.
It shows you've analyzed their justification and found it wanting, based on your own clear criteria.
It's so much more effective. Think about the beliefs regarding the Mahdi or the descent of Jesus.
Right, which are presented as requirements of faith, but come from non-Quranic sources.
So you briefly recognize that these concepts were introduced to, maybe define the community's future expectations or fill some cultural desire, but then you immediately reiterate the core principle.
If these points are not requirements of faith in the Quran itself, they cannot be considered true divine law.
Regardless of their cultural weight.
Or their scholarly weight. That's the critical distinction. It moves the discussion from, is this verse in the Quran, to a much more robust question.
Even if scholars believe this, does it override the explicit completeness of the revelation?
That's the key. You use your own methodology, maybe referencing that verse about using only the Quran for confrontation, to explicitly state the hierarchy of sources.
You could suggest phrasing like, while we recognize these interpretations attempt to solve legal gaps,
Our criterion must remain the revealed word.
And that word confirms that anything not sourced by God risks fundamentally violating the completion of the faith. See? It transforms the critique from just a simple search for verses into a high-level discussion on the philosophy of source material.
Yeah, I think the listener will find that approach far more authoritative and, honestly, much more difficult for an opponent to refute.
We've covered a lot of ground here, I think, in strengthening what is already a very powerful piece.
We have. Should we do a quick summary of the 3 big actionable steps?
Let's do it. So first, shift your focus from a reactive critique to an affirmative structure.
Absolutely. Clearly define your comprehensive, Quran-only theological framework. Use detailed explanations of worldly life and the afterlife to actively replace the concepts you've refuted. Give the reader a complete roadmap.
Second, modulate that rhetorical intensity.
Focus your critique on the methodology, on its misapplication, rather than questioning an opponent's intent or their faith.
That preserves the intellectual challenge while maximizing engagement. It's about inviting people in, not pushing them away.
And finally, strengthen your authoritative rejection by briefly but strategically engaging with the interpretive history of these contested rulings.
Show that you understand their justifications, be it traditions or consensus, before you decisively reject those secondary sources that conflict with the primary authority of the divine revelation.
The intellectual energy and the passion in this work are so clear. And these adjustments, I think, will really solidify its logical foundation and its persuasive impact.
We strongly encourage you to apply these insights. And please, submit the improved material back to us for a future critique. We'd love to see it.
Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today really cuts right to the heart of religious identity and practice. It emerges from material that's grappling with the fundamental definition of deen, the comprehensive way of life prescribed by faith. And this material, it really exposes a profound crisis concerning religious authority, specifically, the ultimate source for legal and theological rulings, or hook. The stakes are immense. Is tradition a necessary guide, or is it a source of burden and public alienation?
That sense of burden and alienation is exactly the point, isn't it? I mean, that's what the material highlights. If we look at the historical trajectory of faith, we see how complexity and legalism they've often obscured the original clarity of the message. If believers are led to feel that the faith is imposing expectations and structures that are foreign to the divine text, then that spiritual crisis is very, very real.
So, the central question we face then is this. Is the comprehensive framework of the deen strictly and solely defined by the explicit verses and direct commands of the Quran, the Kitabullah, or must it necessarily incorporate subsequent legal and theological rulings derived from authoritative, non-Quranic traditional sources? I'll be arguing for the traditional approach, which is rooted in centuries of scholarly consensus historically embodied by the Ahl-Sunnah wal Jamaat.
And I come at it from a completely different perspective. I'll argue for the position that the deen is confined exclusively to the Quran. My focus is on textual clarity and sovereignty, prioritizing what God explicitly revealed over, later scholarly interpretations or cultural additions. Those additions that the source material so critically refers to as superstitions.
Okay, so let's hear your opening position.
My core thesis is really that the deen must be entirely and sufficiently sourced from the clear, direct evidence of the Quran. To introduce additional legal rulings, hukum, or core articles of faith that lack an explicit foundational textual basis is, quite simply, to corrupt the faith. When people look at this long list of judicial requirements or detailed theological doctrines handed down by tradition, they just become confused. They see all this complexity, and they ask that profound, challenging question we find in the material. What did God do to you? It implies, why have you made this faith so impossible, so severe?
I do acknowledge the power of that question. It speaks directly to the spiritual state of the believer. But I would argue that simplicity often comes at the cost of functionality.
Functionality or accretion. Look, the material points to specific examples of judicial and eschatological concepts that are central to the traditional framework, but are not explicitly required by the Quran. Think of the legal requirements for capital punishment, the requirement to kill the apostate, the stoning of the adulterer, or the execution of those who neglect the formal prayer. These are severe life and death hukum that are often derived from secondary sources, not a direct, clear command within the book itself. They are judicial or eschatological concepts that have been, in my view, illegitimately added.
I see why you demand textual purity. I do, particularly when we're dealing with capital offenses. However, a complete din necessarily incorporates and relies upon established traditional frameworks, specifically the position of Ahl-Sunnah wal Jamaat to define comprehensive practice and legal rulings, to dismiss historically accepted points concerning governance or theological structure as merely, superstition? That fundamentally undermines the historical consensus of the Ummah, the global community, and the established authority of respected scholars.
But the issue isn't consensus, it's authority. If the source material for these rulings is not the Quran, by what divine authority do they govern life and death?
Well, they provide necessary structure and practical applications that fulfill the broader intent of the faith. We have to consider the necessity of methodology. The Quran is often concise, right? It establishes principles rather than providing exhaustive legal codes for every potential conflict in a complex society. So, traditional methodology employs rigorous tools like analogical reasoning, qiyas, and scholarly consensus, ijma, to derive hukm for specific situations not explicitly detailed in the Quran. This isn't ignoring the divine command. It's the established, time-tested process for implementing the divine command in reality.
And that brings us directly to the definition of legal authority. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the traditional methodology for deriving life and death hukum is sufficient, especially when you consider the Quran's own very strong stance on governance. The material draws our attention to Surah 5, which states unequivocally that those who do not rule by Allah's revealed verses are disbelievers, oppressors, and rebellious. I mean, the weight of that command is just undeniable. So if the deen must be only the verses of Allah, then how can practices like killing apostates or stoning adulterers, rulings often derived primarily from hadith reports or ijma, how can they possibly be part of the deen? They are, by definition, rulings not made strictly according to an explicit direct command within the book.
Those verses, 544 to 46, are of immense gravity, and no one in the traditional consensus denies their authority. But here's the critical distinction that traditional scholarship makes. Those verses condemn those who reject the divine law and replace it wholesale with human preference or, lawlessness. They do not condemn the legitimate, established scholarly process of using the Quran's principles to deduce specific legal applications, the very process I just described, qiyas and ijma.
But when you apply qiyas to a matter of blood and life, you are claiming that the analogy holds divine weight equal to an explicit verse. If God intended capital punishment for a specific crime, the text should state it clearly, as it does for some other punishments. When scholars rely on a fragmented hadith or some analogy to impose death, they are substituting human derivation for divine clarity. And this is precisely the issue. If it is not explicitly in the book, it risks being a ruling not according to Allah's verses, which invokes those extremely severe condemnations in Surah 5.
I would challenge the premise that everything must be explicitly stated in a single, unimpeachable verse. The Prophet's role, according to the Quran itself, was not just to recite, but to clarify and exemplify the book. His practice, the Sunnah, and the subsequent consensus of the community serve as the authoritative explanation of the Quran's intent. If we demand absolute textual explicitness for every single legal ruling, the resulting deen becomes entirely impractical. It becomes a theoretical faith, not a functioning legal and societal structure.
I disagree. Practicality should never outweigh theological integrity. If God intended the Quran to be sufficient as the text strongly suggests it is, then the additions made through tradition are what confuse people. They see a religion of purity and simplicity, and then they're given 1,000 years of legal commentary that requires them to believe in things that seem fantastical or impose laws that lack a clear textual source. It leads right back to that question of alienation.
Well, let's pivot to a major theological area where that tension between purity and completeness is starkly illustrated: eschatology. I would defend the detailed beliefs, the very subject of those 100-hour lectures mentioned in the material, regarding the concept of barzakh and the grave chastisement. These beliefs provide necessary comfort, warning, and continuity.
I find that defense very difficult to accept. The Quran speaks only of two lives: the worldly life, dunya, and the final afterlife, akhirat. The concept of barzakh, this intermediate state, as tradition describes it, is deeply problematic. It posits that immediately upon burial, the soul is conscious and subject to vivid physical suffering, snakes, scorpions, and pain.
It's not physical suffering in the earthly sense. It is a spiritual, yet intensely perceived reality.
It's designed to confirm the consequences of one's actions before the final reckoning.
But this localized consequence fundamentally undermines the entire structure of the Day of Judgment, the Qiyamah Kuni. The Quran clearly defines Qiyamah as the day of calculation, the Hisab Kuni. If people are already being judged, punished, or rewarded in their graves, determining their ultimate fate, what is the unique significance of the grand resurrection? We cite Surah Fatiha, verse 4, owner of the Day of Judgment. The judgment belongs to that day. The traditional idea that angels enter the grave immediately to question the dead and determine their entry to heaven or hell beforehand effectively preempts and dilutes the unique significance of Qiyamah.
I would frame it differently. Barzakh is not the final calculation. It is a temporary state. It's necessary theological scaffolding. If we only describe the binary of this life and the next, there is a theological vacuum regarding the state of the soul immediately after death and before the resurrection. Tradition fills this vacuum, ensuring that believers maintain a continuous sense of accountability. And furthermore, the material used by traditionalists to establish Barzakh comes not from thin air, but from prophetic reports that clarify the period between death and resurrection.
Predict the clear, textual structure of the Quran, which prioritizes the great reckoning above all else, then they must be rejected. To establish an entire life stage, a conscious, suffering existence full of snakes and scorpions that has no connection with the Quran, as the material asserts, is a conceptual error. It complicates and sensationalizes the faith. It turns profound theological concepts into fantastical fables that drive believers away.
But if we strip away every element of the unseen and the immediate consequences of death merely because it isn't spelled out in legal detail in the Quran, we reduce the depth of the faith and remove necessary comfort and warning. The tradition ensures continuity.
And that very effort to ensure continuity leads directly to our third point, the role of prophets and intercession, or shafa'at. Traditional narratives rely heavily on the concept that Muhammad, peace be upon him, will be granted the ability to intercede for the faithful on the Day of Judgment.
That is essential to the completeness of the faith. It speaks profoundly to the boundless mercy of God and the exalted status of his messenger, offering immense hope to humanity.
But if we hold strictly to the Quranic definitions of God and the prophet, do these ideas remain? The Quran is insistent that judgment belongs solely to God. We find powerful verses, including implicit references in Surah 31, suggesting that on the Day of Judgment, no soul can benefit another soul, and that intercession belongs entirely to God and only takes place by his explicit permission and only for those whom he approves.
You use the term explicit permission. That is precisely where the traditional position finds its footing. The power of intercession certainly belongs entirely to God, but tradition argues that the prophets or specific righteous individuals will be granted that ability by God on the Day of Judgment as an honor and a manifestation of divine mercy. It is not an independent power, it is a bestowed power.
But the issue is whether the necessity of that bestowed power is based on clear instruction or on theological preference. When the Quran emphasizes that every soul is responsible for its own actions, and that on that terrifying day, the links of kinship and friendship will be severed, inserting an intermediary, even a divinely appointed one, creates confusion. The fear for those of us committed to textual purity is that this focus on the prophet's intercession risks diminishing the singularity of God's absolute judicial authority.
I believe you misinterpret the intention. This tradition arises not out of a desire to diminish God, but to enhance the believer's appreciation for the prophet's standing and the sheer scope of God's mercy. If you remove the hope of intercession, you create a very stark, perhaps terrifying judicial framework that offers less spiritual reassurance to the average believer navigating this complex world.
And I believe that by adding this hope without clear, explicit textual command, you introduce the kind of doctrinal confusion that leads to spiritual skepticism. If the Quran says that judgment belongs absolutely to God, then we should stick to that without adding intermediate steps or actors, regardless of how comforting those additions might be. Comfort cannot be the source of law or theology.
So the distinction then is whether the tools of tradition like qiyas and ijma are seen as authoritative explanations that activate the intent of the book, or whether they are illegitimate additions that dilute the clarity of the book. Ultimately, our entire debate hinges on defining the boundaries of din. I maintain that the din is solely the Quran. Any inclusion of non-Quranic concepts, be they life or death legal rulings derived from secondary sources, or theological doctrines like the sensory suffering in the barzakh state, these are the primary cause of the spiritual confusion and the widespread skepticism we see today. The path to purity lies in recognizing these additions and returning to the pure way of life defined by the Kitab al-Law.
While I appreciate the desire for textual rigor and the pure textual clarity that drives the Quran-only perspective, I must reaffirm that complexity and governance often require multiple authoritative perspectives and tools of interpretation. A functional, faithful religious life necessitates practical and judicial structures, the comprehensive hukm that are provided by established traditions like the Ahli Sunnah wal Jama'ah. The methodology of the scholars is not an addition. It is the necessary guidance for the application of the book's vast principles.
The sufficiency of the Quran means any addition is a distraction.
And my position is that the functionality and governance required of a complete din necessitates the robust structures that tradition has developed over centuries to uphold the comprehensive intent of the book. The divergence exists precisely in how we define what constitutes an adequate and authoritative source of religious law. So, we've explored a profound and enduring disagreement regarding the very foundations and boundaries of the deen. We must leave our listeners to deeply consider the significant implications of both a strict textual reductionism and an encompassing traditional framework for faith and society. Thank you for joining us for The Debate.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep into a fiercely intellectual and, I think it's fair to say, politically charged theological debate. It's delivered by Hamid Nasrdan, and specifically his detailed response to Habibullah Kusani.
Right.
And the central, deeply provocative question that frames his entire argument, I mean, the title itself just demands your attention, is, what did God do to you?
That phrase is, it's so much more than just a rhetorical question.
It really is.
It's the intellectual core of this entire deep dive. I mean, it's a challenge. It's directed at anyone who feels that frustration or disillusionment, alienation when they look at the religious establishment.
Right.
So our mission here for you, the learner, is to get a crystal clear, really detailed understanding of Nasrdan's argument. And it's a textualist argument.
Very strictly textual.
Extremely. It's an argument that seeks to completely redraw the boundaries of what religious adherence even means.
Yeah. And when we say redraw the boundaries, you're not exaggerating. I mean, he is trying to establish a strict, almost uncompromising textual wall, a wall between what is divine command and what is just human accumulation.
Yes, centuries of it. So the source material we're looking at, these excerpts from his response, they're a direct frontal assault on the theological methodology.
And the established practices.
And the established practices of, several very established groups. He specifically calls out those adhering to what he labels as the foundational beliefs of Ahli Sunnah wal Jama'ah.
So the mainstream.
He's going right for the heart of the mainstream tradition.
Yeah.
Precisely. The central conflict, it just boils down to a profound difference in definition.
The definition of what religion is.
Exactly. Nasrdan claims that much of what is commonly accepted as true religion, well, it's not din, it's not the divinely mandated faith. He says it's Khurofat.
Okay, and Khurofat is a fascinating word here. We need to unpack that.
We really do.
It doesn't just mean, like, tradition. It's more loaded than that.
It's way more loaded. It's a term that encompasses everything from, outright superstition and folklore to just simple cultural traditions.
Things that have crept in over time.
Right. Historical accretion, human interpretation, things that he argues have been mistakenly elevated to the status of divine law.
So he's basically saying that by mixing the pure word of God with all this human stuff, these centuries of interpretation and custom, you create a distorted and often really negative impression of the faith.
And that's his whole point. It's this theological muddiness, this confusing blend of divine law and historical folklore that causes people to look at the whole system, feel alienated, and then ask that, that really penetrating question.
Judosis larga nima kildi. What did God do to you?
Yes, as if God is somehow to blame for the complexity or the harshness of a system that humans built.
That's a really powerful rhetorical strategy.
It's brilliant because he shifts the blame for any religious alienation entirely onto the religious establishment itself. He's arguing they've created an overly burdensome, a confusing faith by introducing all these elements that he claims are simply not in the core scripture.
And in doing that, he establishes his own stance as, what, the voice of pure reason?
The voice of the text? He claims he uses the Quran exclusively to expose these errors.
Right, he makes a point of saying this, that he's publicly corrected others before, including Kusani.
But he also praises them. He says he praises them when their statements align with the book.
So he's trying to position himself as an impartial arbiter.
Exactly. Not a rival scholar with his own school of thought, but just a conduit. He emphasizes that he speaks only with the authority of the Book of Allah. He's positioning himself not as an opponent, but merely as the voice of the Quran itself.
That self-positioning is so critical, isn't it?
It's everything.
Yeah.
Because if he is just articulating the text, then any critique against him becomes, by extension, a critique against the divine revelation.
You can't argue with him, you can only argue with God.
That's the corner he puts you in. He creates this immediate, unavoidable, and really stark binary for you, the listener. And look, he's not just critiquing minor rituals here. He's going after the entire philosophical method of how you derive religious truth in the first place.
He's saying very simply.
Very simply, if your practice, your belief cannot be proven by the divine text alone, then it is not divine. And if it's not divine, then it is, by his definition, Khurofat. This textual minimalism, this radical simplicity, becomes the bedrock for every single challenge that he's about to make.
Okay, so here's where the philosophical challenge really begins to take shape. Nasruddin immediately sets up this dramatic, almost high-stakes choice for defining true religion. He's forcing his opponents into a corner right from the very first move.
He really is. He essentially throws down an intellectual gauntlet. He's forcing anyone who claims to follow Islam to justify how they derive their understanding. The question he poses is devastating in its simplicity.
Which is?
If you say you are in this din, meaning Islam, what proves you're Islam?
And that's not a question about, how sincere you are in your heart.
Not at all. It's an epistemological demand. It's about knowledge. He wants to know the source and the methodology of your religious beliefs. Where did you get this from? Show me the proof.
And then he lays out two paths, two options, which he presents as fundamentally incompatible.
Completely incompatible.
The first path is what you could call the maximalist, the traditional approach.
Right. He asks, are you making numerous rules that are not explicitly found in Allah's book into din? Are you, inventing, incorporating, or elevating human interpretations, even ones that are centuries old, to the status of a divine command?
That's path number one, the path of tradition, of accumulation.
Path number one. The second path, of course, is the one he advocates. And it's defined by strict adherence and a kind of minimalism, he asks. Or do you follow a specific idea, a perspective? He uses the word karash, a worldview based only on the rulings explicitly contained in Allah's book.
Only the ones in the book.
And this is the crucial part. He says this requires adding nothing, changing nothing, and accepting only what Allah explicitly deems halal permissible and haram forbidden within the Quranic verses themselves.
So no footnotes, no commentary, no scholarly consensus, just the raw text.
Just the text. This stance, by necessity, it involves a near-total rejection of extra-Quranic sources as a basis for establishing religious law.
Which is a huge deal, because traditional Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh, it's famously complex, and it relies so heavily on sources outside the Quran to build a comprehensive legal structure.
It absolutely does. I mean, traditional jurisprudence is generally built on four main pillars, four sources.
Right, the Quran is first.
The Quran is first, of course.
Yeah.
But then you have the hadith, the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad. Then ijma, which is scholarly consensus. And finally, qiyas, or analogical reasoning.
And Nasruddin is essentially taking an axe to those last three pillars.
He is. He's explicitly criticizing the reliance on them, especially the hadith and the subsequent consensus that's been built upon it over centuries. He's effectively saying, show me the text, not the tradition. Show me the divine word, not the human interpretation of it.
But for an audience steeped in that tradition, this must sound like a radical, almost impossible position to take. I mean, if you reject the hadith, you lose most of the detailed instructions on how to pray.
How to pray, how to fast, how to perform the Hajj pilgrimage.
You lose the entire historical context of the Prophet's life that gives meaning to so much of the Quran.
You do.
So the obvious question is, how does he propose maintaining a functioning religious society without that huge, extensive interpretive scaffolding?
And that is the ultimate challenge to his position. You're right. It forces us to understand just how absolute his textual demand is. He demands singular, explicit proof for everything.
One verse.
One verse. He challenges his opponents. Provide a single explicit verse, an ayat, from the Quran to support your beliefs and practices. He completely refuses to accept arguments based on, say, combining a few different hadith to make a point.
Or the classic, what the scholars agreed upon.
He dismisses that entirely. That concept of ijma, scholarly consensus, holds no water for him. For him, if a rule, especially a severe one, is truly from God, it must be explicitly and unambiguously stated in God's final revelation, period.
So he's not really engaging in a debate about interpretation. It's more fundamental. He's engaging in a debate about source legitimacy.
That's it exactly. He is, in effect, relegating the entire scholarly apparatus, all those centuries of fee and commentary and legal opinions, to the realm of historical opinion.
Interesting, but ultimately human.
Interesting but human, not divine law.
And this is why he zeroes in so directly on the beliefs and practices of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jamaat.
Precisely. He accuses their foundational beliefs, their etiquette, which rely so heavily on these synthesized non-Quranic sources. He accuses them of causing the systemic confusion that pushes people toward that question.
What did God do to you?
He implies that their complexity is what creates the alienation.
Let's break that down a bit more because it's a powerful critique. The strength of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jamaat methodology is its comprehensiveness, right? Its tradition, its willingness to incorporate historical data, linguistic analysis, that scholarly consensus.
It's a vast and rich intellectual tradition, but Nasruddin turns that strength into a fatal weakness.
How so?
He suggests that this very complexity, the need to consult multiple massive volumes of hadith compilations, the endless debates over the validity of narrators, the reliance on what the consensus was in Baghdad in the 9th century or Cairo in the 12th, he says that is what generates the confusion and the frustration.
His argument is, if God's law is simple, perfect, and clear, why do you need a whole library and a lifetime of study just to figure out the basics?
You've nailed it. His core critique is epistemological. The foundational beliefs of the tradition are flawed because their source methodology is flawed. They incorporate all this complexity, all this historical precedent, all this interpretation layered on top of the foundational text, and in doing so, he says, they obscure the true pure din.
So the key takeaway from this first part of his argument is really that Nasruddin is presenting a radical argument for purification.
It's a full-on theological reboot.
He believes that by stripping away everything, all the historical, cultural, scholarly interpretation, he is returning the divine law to its original unpolluted state.
Yes, and he claims that this mixture of din and Khurofat isn't just, academically wrong. He thinks it's socially and spiritually damaging.
Because it creates a faith that feels burdensome and unclear to the average person.
A faith that makes them ask the wrong questions about God. So he's positioning the Quran not just as the primary source, but as the exclusive authority for every single matter of faith and law. And to prove his point, he moves immediately from these abstract principles to some very specific, very high-stakes judicial and theological claims.
Right. Nasruddin doesn't waste any time once he establishes his Quran-only rule. He immediately starts putting names to these claimed superstitions, these Khurofat.
And he starts with the most severe rulings imaginable, the ones that carry the weight of life and death in traditional jurisprudence.
This is where, as you said, the philosophical argument becomes a legal and a moral crisis for traditionalists.
It really is. The doctrines he challenges are not, minor rituals about how you wash your hands. They are often foundational elements of criminal law and public order in historically Islamic societies.
So let's get into these disputed judicial rulings and punishments. The source material lists several rulings that he claims are not found in the Quran, but are still being enforced as din. First and foremost, he claims that capital punishment for apostasy, for the murtad, a person who leaves the faith, is non-existent in the Quran.
This is a monumental challenge. Historically, the death penalty for apostasy has been a central pillar of established jurisprudence.
Where does that ruling come from traditionally?
It's derived primarily from a very famous hadith, a saying attributed to the Prophet, which is often translated as, "Whoever changes his religion, kill him."
So it's a hadith, not a Quranic verse.
Exactly. And Nasruddin's strict textual standard completely bypasses that entire tradition. By demanding a direct Quranic verse for it, which doesn't exist, he is essentially asserting that God did not command this punishment.
And
therefore, enforcing it is an act of human oppression, not divine justice.
that immediately raises the stakes to the highest possible level. If a ruling is based solely on a hadith, and he rejects hadith as a source of divine law, then any application of that ruling is, in his view.
It's the application of Khurofat by human beings, not din by God. Full stop.
And the second major challenge he makes follows a very similar logic. It focuses on capital punishment for adultery, or zinacore.
Yes, and specifically, he claims that the practice of stoning Shumagisa is completely non-existent in the Quran.
Stoning for adultery is maybe the most globally recognized, certainly the most controversial and yet established ruling within a lot of traditional Islamic law. How does his textual demand confront this one so directly?
Well, it creates an explicit contradiction, which is exactly his goal. The ruling of stoning is derived almost entirely from very specific and some would say highly contested hadith narratives.
Stories about the Prophet ordering it.
Right. But, and this is the key, the Quran does explicitly prescribe a punishment for fornication, which is unmarried sexual relations.
It does in Surah An-Nur.
In Surah An-Nur, chapter 24. And that punishment is a specific number of lashes, often set at 100.
So Nasirdan's argument is devastatingly simple. If God intended stoning a unique and incredibly severe form of execution as the punishment for this, why did he explicitly define a different punishment, lashing, in his own book?
Exactly. By demanding a Quranic verse for Shumagisa, he insists that tradition has overridden the explicit, established law of the Quran with a punishment derived from non-textual sources.
It all comes back to his core principle.
It always does. Only Allah can establish a punishment of this severity, and if he did, it must be clearly and unambiguously stated in the text.
And we see this trend continue with the third judicial example he gives.
We do. He rejects the idea that a failure to pray namaz should result in a death sentence. He calls this completely non-Quranic.
And again, the traditional position justifying that, it's not from a direct verse, is it?
No, it's generally derived through complex analogical reasoning, qiyas, or from specific interpretations of certain hadith.
So he is drawing this hard line in the desert sand. He is demanding a specific verse for any ruling that authorizes the state to take a human life.
It turns the whole debate into a moral argument. He's saying, if you are going to take a life, if you are going to rule on fundamental law, you must show me the explicit command of God, not the compiled opinions of scholars from 1,000 years ago.
It suggests the pure din is inherently more restrained, maybe more merciful, in its punishments than the established traditions have become.
That is absolutely the implication. But his targets aren't just limited to criminal law. He also disputes required beliefs, especially when it comes to eschatology and prophecy, beliefs about the end times.
Right.
He specifically names two major beliefs: the descent of Isa, Jesus, and the emergence of the Mahdi. He says belief in these things is not a required condition for faith, for Iman, in the Quran.
Wow. I mean, these figures, Isa returning and the Mahdi emerging to restore justice, they are absolutely foundational to the end-time narratives for huge segments of the global religious community.
They are central.
So why is he so insistent on removing them from the core conditions of faith of Iman? What's the goal there?
Because the criteria for Iman defines who is a believer. It defines what you must accept to be saved.
It's the bottom line.
It is the absolute bottom line. And these figures and their detailed narratives, they are extensively laid out in hadith compilations, but they are not explicitly detailed as requirements for faith in the Quran itself.
So by removing them, he's what? Simplifying the faith.
He is drastically reducing the scope of necessary belief. He's making the definition of a Muslim much, much simpler. It's based strictly on the Quranic definition of faith rather than on complex apocalyptic narratives that are derived from secondary sources.
He shifts the focus.
It completely shifts the focus from, say, preparing for a future messianic leader to focusing solely on your obedience to the current existing text.
This brings us to the crux of his moral and theological argument, which, as you said earlier, is like a theological nuclear bomb.
It really is.
Master Dan asserts that those who rule or judge based on anything other than Allah's verses are violating the divine command, and he says they're subject to immediate terrible categorization.
This is where he escalates the discussion from a scholarly disagreement to what sounds a lot like religious excommunication. He isn't just saying they are mistaken, he is accusing them of placing themselves outside the boundary of divine authority.
By accepting human or historical rulings over the clear, explicit text.
Yes. And he doesn't just say this on his own authority, he justifies it by citing specific verses from the Quran, from Surah 5, specifically verses 44, 45, and 46.
And in those verses, he declares that those who do not judge by what Allah has revealed fall into three incredibly severe categories.
Three categories that are used as a kind of continuum of separation from God's command. The first is zalimlar, which means the oppressors or the wrongdoers.
Okay.
The second is fasiklar, the sinners or the transgressors.
Which is worse.
It is. And the third, the most severe, is kafirlar, the disbelievers.
Can you just elaborate on the sheer weight of applying those specific labels in the theological argument? I mean, this is not just name-calling.
It's the furthest thing from it. In Islamic thought, to be a zalim means you are committing a grave injustice, often against yourself or God, by misusing power or authority. In this case, by ruling by something other than God's law.
And a fasik?
To be a fasik means you are knowingly defying God's command. You are living in open transgression. These are serious, damning terms for any believer to hear applied to them.
But the use of kafir, disbeliever, that changes the entire nature of the accusation. That's a line you don't cross lightly.
You don't. The application of kafir is the ultimate declaration of separation. When Nasiruddin states that those who follow these non-Quranic rulings are not on the din of the Quran, he is justifying it by arguing they have committed an act of disbelief.
What's the act of disbelief specifically?
The act is believing that human law or historical tradition is superior to or even equivalent to God's explicit text in matters of life and death and fundamental faith.
So his logic is, if the book itself defines those who fail to rule by its verses in these terms, oppressors, sinners, and disbelievers, how can anyone who rules by hadith or consensus claim to be following the true din?
That's his checkmate move. It transforms the debate from an academic interpretation of jurisprudence, of fiqh, into a matter of fundamental religious standing and eternal salvation. It is an incredibly aggressive rhetorical maneuver.
And it forces people to make a choice.
It forces introspection, and he concludes this whole section with a direct, uncompromising call to action. He demands that those who preach these errors must repent tawbah, or, at the very least, they must openly admit that their beliefs are their own din, a human-made tradition, a form of Khurofat.
But not the authentic, pure din of the Quran.
Exactly.
That challenge is brilliant in its simplicity, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because if they admit it's their din, then his criticism of their methodology kind of stops.
It does, because they are no longer claiming divine authority for it. But of course,
admitting that centuries of accepted law is merely folklore would shatter the legitimacy of the entire traditional religious structure they represent.
it's a challenge designed to reveal what he sees as hypocrisy. It forces them to choose between textual authority and their own institutional tradition. He's saying, stop claiming the authority of the Quran while simultaneously contradicting its alleged silence on these major judicial issues.
Okay, let's just take a breath for a second, because we are transitioning now from these high-stakes earthly laws, capital punishment, life and death, to even higher stakes, eternal life.
Right.
The speaker now tackles some of the most widely accepted beliefs about the time between death and resurrection. These are doctrines that often create the most profound psychological and emotional responses in believers.
And this transition really demonstrates the comprehensive scope of his textual minimalism. He's not content just to purify the law, he intends to purify the spiritual and existential landscape of the faith as well.
He's moving into the realm of fear and comfort.
Deeply. His central target here is the rejection of what's known as grave punishment, or qabr azabi.
Okay.
Nasiruddin makes this highly controversial claim that while, and he uses this number, 100 hours of sermons, or derislar, may be dedicated to this topic.
100 hours.
There is not a single verse, not one, not a single verse in the Quran that speaks of qabr azabi.
The emphasis on 100 hours is so key to his rhetorical strategy there.
It is. It highlights the vast amount of time and energy and effort the religious establishment dedicates to a concept that he claims is entirely non-Quranic.
It suggests this enormous superstructure has been built on what he perceives as a completely false foundation.
A foundation of sand.
So why is the concept of grave punishment so prevalent in traditional sermons? I mean, what psychological power does it hold that warrants so much airtime?
It holds immense power because it introduces immediate accountability.
Right. Not judgment on some far-off day, but right now.
Right now. If judgment and suffering begin the moment you are lowered into the ground, which is often depicted as this dark, confining, terrifying space, it serves as a powerful, immediate deterrent against sin. It reinforces piety through fear.
And the stories are very graphic.
Incredibly graphic. Stories of the grave being narrowed until your ribs cross, of being questioned by these two terrifying angels, Munkar and Nakir, and the physical punishments that follow. These are deeply, deeply ingrained in traditional eschatology.
So by declaring this entire fear-inducing concept void of any Quranic support, Nasruddin is essentially labeling it as pure Khurofat.
Pure superstition. He's trying to dismantle an entire fear-based mechanism of piety.
So what does he offer as a replacement for that?
He advances what the critique calls the two lives theory. He argues that the Quran only describes two lives for humankind. That's it.
Which are?
Dunya Hayati, which is your worldly life, and Akhirat Hayati, the afterlife. This is the minimalist model applied to existence itself. You have your life in this world, you have the life of the hereafter. A clean binary. You live, you die, you are resurrected, you are judged. There is no intermediate, conscious, sensory stage of ongoing reward or punishment.
It's a theological model designed to simplify and, I suppose, rationalize the process of death according to his strict textual limitations.
It is, and this stance leads him directly to his explicit rejection of Barzakh Hayati.
The traditional intermediate stage of existence between death and the Day of Judgment.
The very same. He spends a significant amount of time refuting the common, highly detailed depictions of the Barzakh period.
The ones drawn from non-Quranic sources.
Primarily. We're talking about the very specific descriptions. The deceased person sitting up in their grave, being questioned by the angels, and then either resting comfortably or being subjected to immediate graphic torture.
And he focuses on a specific detail.
He does. The detail of being bitten by scorpions and snakes before the Day of Judgment even arrives.
So why does he find this concept so problematic? I mean, beyond just lacking Quranic proof, what's the philosophical contradiction he sees in the idea of the Barzakh?
He argues that the concept of Barzakh Hayati fundamentally nullifies the true significance of death, and he says it contradicts the Quranic narrative that's centered on the Day of Judgment itself.
How so?
Well, his reasoning goes something like this. If suffering and reward, complete with scorpions and snakes, begin immediately upon death, and if this is a conscious sensory experience, then accountability and consequences are already being dispensed in full before the great day.
So if the consequences are already being dispensed in the grave, then the Day of Judgment, which the Quran itself calls the owner of the Day of Judgment in Surah Fatiha, is diminished. Its central role is undermined.
Precisely. He seems to view the traditional Barzakh as essentially a mini judgment day, which makes the actual final Day of Judgment kind of redundant.
The final, ultimate Day of Reckoning loses its gravity if the dead are already being fully tormented or rewarded.
It does. Nasruddin insists on a reading of the Quran that maintains the dramatic, singular importance of the Akhirat Hayati, the resurrection, as the moment when true, final justice begins, not a moment before.
So if he rejects this conscious, active Barzakh Hayati, what is his definition of death? What does he say the state of the soul is between the dunya and the akhirat?
Nasruddin describes death as simply closing one's eyes, a state of cessation, a rest or a sleep. He vehemently rejects the idea that a conscious life continues right after death with sensory feelings and sensations.
No scorpions biting, no angels conversing.
None of it. Not until the resurrection. He is arguing for a state that aligns with the Quranic concept of sleep or rest until the trumpet sounds.
That feels like a massive shift in spiritual psychology.
It is.
Instead of fearing immediate suffering, his view offers a kind of dignified rest, a pause.
And it is entirely intended to be comforting. He argues that these detailed, frightening beliefs, the scorpions, the narrow grave, the immediate questioning, they make people afraid and uneasy about the din. He says they cause people to shrink away from it and to question God's justice.
The implication is clear. God would not create a faith that requires such terror derived from what he calls unproven folklore.
The pure din of the Quran, he implies, offers a more logical and less fear-based transition between the two lives.
And finally, in this section, he touches on the concept of shafat, intercession.
Yes. The idea that revered figures, most notably the Prophet Muhammad, can intercede on behalf of believers on the Day of Judgment.
This is another massive pillar of traditional religious belief and practice that he's trying to dismantle with the same textual logic.
It is. And in the traditional view, shafat offers immense comfort. It's a potential safety net for those who, while sincere, may have fallen short of perfect piety. Nasruddin questions the idea of an automatic blanket intercession.
He cites verses from Surah 52 and Surah 31, referencing the Day of Judgment where people are raised from their graves and questioned. How does that reference contradict the idea of intercession?
By focusing on the intense individual nature of the questioning and accountability that's described in the Quran, I mean, if the entire process of the afterlife is about personal responsibility, every single soul being raised and questioned individually about their own deeds, then the concept of an automatic or comprehensive intercession seems to undermine that strict individual reckoning.
You're saying you can't have it both ways.
He suggests that the focus should be on preparing your own ledger, your own book of deeds, not on relying on a prophet to, bail you out. He is shifting the entire spiritual relationship from one of reliance on an intermediary to one of direct, absolute responsibility before God.
It seems like every single claim he makes, from the judicial rulings on earth to the eschatology of the afterlife, it's all driven by this single-minded desire to simplify, to clarify, and to intensify the relationship between the individual believer and the explicit text of the Quran.
That is the perfect summary. The entire operation is a radical purification. It's intended to remove all the human-made complexity, all the perceived harshness, and all the fear tactics that he argues have accumulated over centuries of tradition.
So let's try and synthesize all of this. What we've unpacked here is that the speaker's entire mission is to establish a din that is completely and exclusively defined by the Quran alone, a faith that has been purified of all Khurofat and all tradition.
Yes. And he suggests that this minimalist, pure approach allows him and his followers to face any theological confrontation without being shamed.
Why without being shamed?
Because they believe they speak with the direct, unassailable authority of the divine text itself.
The authority claim is everything.
It is the whole game. Nasruddin asserts that when he speaks solely the words of the Quran, even words that directly contradict centuries of accepted norms like stoning or grave punishment, he cannot be refuted or ridiculed.
Because to refute him would be to refute the book.
It would require contradicting Allah's book itself. He claims this unassailable authority is why he is so successful in these debates. He even notes that he only opens himself up to criticism when he speaks his own opinion. But since he claims he is only quoting the Quran, he presents himself as the untouchable messenger of the divine message.
But let's be clear. This claim that centuries of established tradition are simply Khurofat, that is a dangerously radical political and religious stance to take, isn't it?
Oh, it's absolutely radical.
It undermines the authority of every scholar, every institution, and every government that adheres to those traditions.
It does. It forces the audience, it forces you to engage in a profound internal reckoning. He's providing a systematic methodology for believers to deconstruct and discard almost every single non-Quranic element of their inherited religion.
And the danger from the traditionalist perspective.
The danger is that this purification undermines the entire communal and historical identity that has been built around the Prophet's sunnah, his tradition, and the scholarly consensus for over 1,000 years.
And his ultimate goal, this purification, it ties directly back to that original haunting question.
What did God do to you?
He believes that if the community truly understands Allah, as he describes himself in the Quran, a God whose laws are explicit, and whose judgment is reserved for the final day.
And if they understand Muhammad as the Quran describes him, a messenger, not an automatic intercessor,
then others would not dare ask that question.
He suggests that the current traditional models have constructed a caricature of God, a God who commands severe capital punishment for actions not even listed in his own book, or who subjects the deceased to graphic torture like snake bites in the grave the moment they die.
And this fear-based, distorted image is what drives people away.
It's what causes them to despair. The purified din he envisions would reflect a God who is, in his view, rational, whose rulings are perfectly clear within the explicit text, and whose path is unambiguous and merciful in its fundamental structure.
So this source material really presents a fundamental and I think unavoidable choice for you, the learner.
It does.
Is faith built solely on the explicit, literal text of the foundational scripture? Or does adherence to that faith necessarily include the historical consensus, the scholarly interpretation, and all the accumulated traditions that have evolved over centuries to create a functioning communal framework?
It really forces us to examine where that line is drawn. Nasruddin draws the line sharply, right at the edge of the Quran itself. And he demands that everything on the other side of that line, from legal precedent derived from hadith to fear-inducing beliefs about the afterlife, must be labeled Khurofat.
And that leads us to our final provocative closing thought for you to consider. If one's central religious practices and foundational belief system, like, say, the belief in stoning or the belief in grave punishment, are found to contain zero explicit supporting evidence from the holy text they claim to follow.
A claim that Nasrdan argues with tremendous force.
Can that system still claim to be advocating for true din with divine authority? Or is it fundamentally promoting Khurofat? If the vast majority of your belief structure is based on what he calls 100 hours of sermons and not on a single clear verse, what does that say about the integrity and the origin of the faith being practiced